Wir machen weiter. Hallo bei der Recampaign, die Leute, die dazugekommen sind. Danke, dass ihr sitzen geblieben bleibt an die anderen. Wir starten mit unserer zweiten Keynote. Ich wechsle kurz auf Englisch, auch ein englischsprachiger Speaker. We welcome Ben Scott. He says in his introduction that the internet revolution has fundamentally changed how politics worked, but yet few public interest NGOs have mastered how to leverage online tools to amplify the effectiveness of their work. And that has to change, says Ben Scott, and please welcome him on stage.
Good afternoon. It's awesome to see so many people out at Republica, and I hope I can live up to the introduction and give you both an interesting and an entertaining presentation this morning, and then we'll have a discussion. My basic purpose here is to share some ideas on one question, and that question is: how are smart nonprofit organizations using the internet to influence politics and policymaking in new and effective ways? Simple idea, big topic. I'm going to take about 25 minutes to talk about it, and then we're going to have a discussion. I have started out with this image on the board. You can probably see it if you're up front. If you can't see it, what you're looking at is a real-time integration of tweets being sent around the world. Everywhere you see a light is a concentration of thousands of tweets. If you leave this in the background running on your computer, you will quickly get a picture of how immense the use of social media networks are today and the kind of reach and scale that these networks have. But check that out when you get time. Let me... Uh-oh. Oh, no, there we go. Now I've done it. Technical difficulties on the internet presentation. Just looking for the full screen. Here we go. How do we go full screen? Yeah, okay. No, check out the front. Yeah. Okay. No, I just need to move that over. Hold on, just move it over. No? Aha. Okay. So here's where we begin. I'll start by just telling you a little bit about myself and maybe establish some reason why I have something interesting to say on this topic. I know a little bit about building organizations, building online organizing, because I did it for 6 years at a group called Free Press. Free Press was founded in around 2003, and the idea was very similar to what you have seen here with Republica, with Netzpolitik, with Digitale Gesellschaft. The idea was, how can we form a group of citizens who can use the internet to talk about internet policy and to organize citizens in large numbers to engage with government to make good internet policies, to make good media policies. We ran a campaign called SaveTheInternet.com, which was for 4 years the face of the net neutrality campaign in the United States. Was a lot of fun, but most importantly, we built a movement with basically no money and just a handful of people working in an organization spread around the country. We built a movement of 500,000 people, which is still going strong. There are now, I would say, when I started working at Free Press in 2004, there were 3 organizations in Washington that were civil society groups with policy advocacy capability in internet and technology. There were maybe 10 of us total. Today, there are more than a dozen organizations. There are at least 100 people working in the space full-time for nonprofit organizations working just on technology policy. And that movement, that expansion was built largely through internet organizing. And then I went to government, and I worked for this lady, and she was brilliant, and I think one of the best secretaries of state we ever had. And one of the things she did was to think about how we're going to change diplomacy in the internet age. And I had the good fortune to work on internet organizing from the other side of the table, from a government position. And what I found was the work that I did for 6 years at Free Press really informed the work that I did at the State Department, and there were a huge number of overlaps. Turns out the logic of internet organizing, the logic of online education and activation is similar no matter what kind of organization you're sitting in. That's why it makes sense to talk about a small NGO and the US State Department and the Obama campaign of 2008 all in the same breath, because the basic logic of how you do online organizing is the same. The internet doesn't care what you are for or what you are against. It simply empowers you to do what you were going to do anyway, just on a network. And we've all seen lots of great organizations emerge, many of them virtual. Some of them merging online and offline work. Some of them huge and well-resourced. Some of them small and scrappy. We have seen some with nuanced and sophisticated policy and political tactics, and some with a blunt political message and an aggressive strategy. And then we saw in 2008, if you've just seen in the last presentation, if you were here, we saw what online organizing can do with huge resources, lots of money, lots of people, lots of intelligence, lots of passion. The 2008 presidential campaign of Barack Obama was a demonstration of what's possible with online organizing that I think really set the bar. There were lots of online organizing efforts going on before that, but what happened in 2008 was a qualitative increase in scale. And what the Obama team recognized in 2008 is that power dynamics are changing because of the internet. It is now possible to do things with online organizing, with online education, with online activation that were simply impossible before. And you can do them with less money than you could if you're running a door-to-door traditional organizing campaign, and you can do them with less people. We saw the same logic at play during the Arab Spring. Let's call this the network as catalyst theory of online organizing and social change. Small numbers of people, well organized, use the internet to reach a broader audience, get a viral capability, expand their reach, organize more people, engage a larger community, and suddenly play a major role on the political stages that are shaping global politics. The internet doesn't start revolutions, but it sure does help them along. Just like the internet doesn't start you wanting to make change on the cause that motivates you, but it helps your organization, it helps you make your case stronger and make your change faster. Now, it doesn't always work in a positive direction. Some of you may be familiar with this still image. It is the first shot of a movie that was uploaded to YouTube in July of 2012 called The Innocence of Muslims. A movie made by a 55-year-old ex-con in the suburban Los Angeles, designed to insult Islam. It sat on YouTube for 2.5 months until it was distributed via Facebook and got viral and reached a global audience, triggered mass protests in 20 cities, 30 dead, 200 injured. One guy decided to make a YouTube video. It's a tragedy by any measure, but it also shows you the power of the network, the power of a small group of people well organized using network tools to reach a large audience and make change. And lest I become too glorifying of the Obama campaign of 2008, I think the most successful online organizing effort in modern memory is the Tea Party on the right wing of American politics. These are organizations that you may have heard of and you may not have heard of. They are extraordinarily effective online organizers. The Tea Party has built a following of tens of millions. They've hijacked American politics. They've transformed the Republican Party. They've moved the entire debate in Washington to the right. And they began with a small group of people, well organized, using the internet to make change. Network as catalyst. If you're paying attention to Italian politics, you will know that Beppe Grillo, comedian of some note, organized a movement of protest against politics as usual in Italy. He rejected all television interviews, refused to be on the mainstream media, used the internet as an organizing tool, developed more than 1 million followers on Twitter, won 20% of the vote in the last election. Changing power dynamics. What each of these examples show are people learning the same lesson. That what was impossible 10 years ago is now not only possible now, but it's happening all the time. It's happening in small groups and large groups. It's happening in national politics and international politics. And what it reflects is a shift in power from centralized institutions, governments, large companies that own media outlets, transnational corporations, a shift in power from centralized authority to decentralized authority. Small institutions, NGOs like some that many of you may represent, networks of individuals and individuals themselves are now able to play a role on the global stage, on the national stage of politics that was previously impossible. We have gone from a model of power that looks like this to one that looks like this. Now, I'm not saying that we've gone from here to here overnight, or that it's happened in the same way everywhere, or that it's a 100% shift. I'm just saying there's a shift taking place. And if you look, you can see it nearly every day in the newspaper. The shift from power centralized in traditional institutions to power being operated by people at the margins happens every day. The question is, how can we harness that power to further the goals of our own organizations? And let me give you an example about how to think about this. This example comes from a friend of mine who's a professor in New York called Clay Shirky. Some of you may know Clay or have read his books. He writes about this in his book, Cognitive Surplus, which I would recommend to you. And he says, you know, if you want to understand how the world has changed, think about this. Think about, it's 1985. In 1985, if there is a world historical event, an event like the bombing at the Boston Marathon, an event that changes politics, an event that captures the world's attention, what are the odds that someone standing nearby has a camera like this around their neck at the exact right moment, thinks to take that camera and take a picture, gets that camera film, takes it out of the camera, develops the film, takes that picture to a media outlet that has a global institution, and within 24 hours has global distribution of that image? What is the probability that that could happen in 1985? Almost zero. Almost zero. Now, 2013. What is the probability that someone is standing next to a world historical event with a camera, can take a picture or a video and get that video distributed to a global audience within 24 hours? 100%. Unless you are in northern Mali and you're standing next to an important event, someone has a camera. Someone has a social network on the same phone where they took the picture with the camera, and using Twitter or Facebook in seconds, that's distributed around the world. Key point. This is not about technology anymore. It's about social change. Every institution I ever worked for, from small organizations to big government, always started thinking about technology as something over there. It was something that some young person did who we had just hired who understood that internet thing. It was never never considered as core to the work. Today, that has to change. We have to think about technology as a part of the work that we do because it is a driver of social change. So when you're thinking about this inside of your organizations, think about big networks, thinking about social activism. Sure, start with Twitter and Facebook. Why not? Twitter and Facebook have 1.5 billion people on their networks globally. That's a big number. That makes them the largest media outlets in the history of the world. Distributed, decentralized, huge. 25 million Facebook users in Germany alone. I'm often told, I've been in Germany 9 months, and I talk about social media from time to time, and people say, social media is not that big of a deal in Germany. It's not a developed market in social media. It turns out that's just not true. Germany is one of the top 10 social media using countries in the world. But you got to think about social media much more broadly. You've got to think about social media as an ecosystem. You got to think about Facebook and Twitter as big players, but you've got to think about a lot of different other potential outlets. If you're the communications director at an NGO, you've got to understand who's using social media, why are they using it, and what are they using it for, and how does that overlap with your communications goals and your mission. When you begin to map your information environment, you may decide that your strategy is not a Facebook strategy, it's a Twitter strategy. You may decide that YouTube is your go-to. You may think Flickr may be a better option for you, but you won't know until you do your homework. And what you'll find, my guess is that your number one most important strategic concept is how you use social media and its interactions with traditional media. So how many of you were, like me, watching the Arab Spring, in particular the revolution in Egypt, happen live on television? Live on television? Do you remember these guys, almost always young guys, standing in the middle of Tahrir Square, big posters above their heads, where they had written their Twitter handles and their Facebook URLs in Arabic and in English? These guys standing in this huge sea of people that have this big poster above their head, they're showing it to the camera on the building across the street. And so what you have is all the reporter next to the guy with the camera, and everybody who's watching that goes to the Twitter account of the person standing in the middle of the crowd, because that's obviously a witness to one of the most important events in modern history. And so it happens that a 19-year-old with 100 Twitter followers in Egypt has his story broadcast to 100 million Arab television households by Al Jazeera. Network as catalyst. You think about it in the context here in Germany, and it becomes potentially even more interesting because the German media marketplace still is distinct in certain ways. It has very strong traditional media players. Huge audiences still pick up paper newspapers and paper magazines every day. Public television, particularly on the news program, still has huge market share. The fragmentation that has begun to cause ripples in media and communications politics in Berlin is not quite as far along as we have seen it in other markets. So your thinking about social media must really be driven by an understanding of the combinatorial effects, the interaction between social media and traditional media. Because really what we're describing is a new logic of information flows. The production of information has changed. The distribution of information has changed. The consumption of information has changed. The way we get news, the way we share that news with our friends and our colleagues, the way we create our own additive content often happens on the same screen or on a phone. There is a qualitative change in what people are expecting. There is now a greater tolerance for lower production values. People will take a grainy YouTube video shot on an iPhone. They don't need HD quality cameras sitting on top of every building. There is a higher premium put on interactivity. You heard in the earlier presentation how important engagement was to the Obama campaign in 2008. People want to talk back. They want to be heard. They want to interact. And there's the super speed of the internet. Everything is happening in real time, often in a syntax and a language that is unusual and unknown in traditional media forms. So we have to think about these things and these combinations of new media and old media as we plan our communication strategies. So here I want to talk a little bit about strategy, a little bit more about strategy, and talk about the mistakes that we made at Free Press, the mistakes that we made at the State Department, and the lessons learned from those mistakes. The biggest mistake that institutions make when they're taking on new media, thinking about the internet as a tool of organizing and activism and communication, is they think first about speaking. How can I take my press release and chop it up into 140 characters? That is a bad strategy. Thinking about social media exclusively as a one-way communications medium, as a way to reach new audiences, as a broadcast mechanism, ignores the fact that it's a network. Speaking should be your third priority when you're thinking about new media and advocacy. You should listen to who's out there and what they're saying. Find out who they are. How much communication strategy is spent speculating on who might be out there to reach and what they think and how to tailor your messages to better resonate with where they are? Well, in the old media world, you had to guess. Today, you don't. Spend an afternoon on Twitter and read other people's feeds, and you can find out pretty quickly what people are thinking about. And then you can, before you say, hey, okay, now I know what you're thinking about, let me tell you what I think, you can ask them questions. You can engage. You can create a community in social media that allows for trust to build. Then when you go back and you start thinking about, okay, what am I going to say? What's my speaking strategy? It's a lot more likely to be effective. So if you think about signon.org or change.org or other organizations that allow for citizen-driven petitions, think about where they came from. Signon.org is a project of MoveOn.org, and when I was in the early days of Free Press, I knew all the people at MoveOn. They were also in their early days. MoveOn was the largest and most effective online organizing force in American politics for years in the early part of the last decade. MoveOn thought about the internet as a tool of communications. 10 years later, they're thinking about it as an empowering tool. Not how can I tell my members what I think is important as a leader of my organization, but what do my members think is important and how can I give them the tools to do for themselves? The shift from move on to sign on is a great symbol of this move from speak to listen to engage. You can also think about it from a different perspective, from a funding perspective. The second most important thing for any NGO besides what's my mission and my message is how am I going to get money to support my cause? How am I going to pay my staff? How am I going to expand, to grow and scale, to buy a website, to get access to the decision makers who can help me achieve my goal? Well, fundraising environment has begun to change. We can now think about innovative new platforms for raising money. We can see different foundations experimenting with challenge grants, crowdsourcing new ideas. We've got some great NGOs out there who have experimented with microfunding, Kickstarter, TechSoup. Take a look at these. They really are, I think, beginning to move in a direction where the network speaks for and of itself in order to bring resources to the field. Second area of lessons learned. First thing we think about as a policy organization is how do we advocate? How do we make change right now? Something bad is happening, I want to stop it. Some great opportunity is out there, I want to seize it. I need to advocate, I need to get in front of decision makers, and I need to make change right away. That reverses the logic of advocacy. The first thing you have to do is you have to educate people. People can't advocate what they don't know about. And they're not likely to get organized until they're aware of the problem, and they're not going to advocate until they're organized. You've got to flip the logic, and a network is a great way to do that. You know, so when you're building your next email outreach, when you're sending your list, think about how do I get people to be active, but how do I educate them? So this is an infographic that some friends of mine at a group called United Republic sent out. United Republic is all about how do we get money out of politics and keep big companies from controlling the legislative process. And they sent this infographic out. This is about the Keystone Pipeline, and on the left you see the amount of money that's being spent by the oil and gas industry to get the pipeline built, and on the right you see the amount of money spent by those who are opposed to the pipeline. And I had to put it into 2 slides because of the disparity. But what this did for them was gave an educational tool an activist twist. So you see this and you learn what's going on, and it may motivate you to get organized and get active. Networked advocacy has been happening for a long time, but we see it in lots of different contexts. You can think about it as organizations joining coalitions. You can think about it from the perspective of conveners. But the basic idea is none of us as individual organizations have the power to change powerful institutions by ourselves. We have to figure out a way to work together so that we are stronger than the sum of our parts. We do that by coming together at events like Republica and building connections and networks. Those connections are built on people, and the people who trust each other are the ones who work together because they have a common understanding of what they want. They become the nucleus of those small groups of people who use network communications to make change. Networks as catalysts. We're adapting to disruptive change here. We're building organizations that can move quickly. We're not trying to predict the future. We're trying to reduce the time it takes for us to move our organization in a new direction. The measure of our success is how quickly we can adapt to change. So this is a great example. Some of you may be aware of a big campaign that was fought against an internet bill called SOPA. SOPA, long story short, would have allowed network operators to change the way the internet worked in order to protect copyright. One organization, which was less than a year old, called Fight for the Future, crowdfunded enough money to put up this billboard in the middle of the district of the chairman of the committee in the House that was controlling the future of the bill. Clever and effective. Both SOPA and PIPA, its Senate counterpart, were defeated in large measure by a huge grassroots effort that brought together, I think, the best example of networked advocacy I've ever seen, of organizations from activist organizations to policy organizations to big companies all joined together to black out their websites for an entire day to draw attention to legislation that was moving in Washington, and they killed the bills. They defeated very, very powerful lobbies and changed the debate about what internet policy is. Now, some of you may have seen some of this. It happened here too. The momentum and the spirit of SOPA came into play here in Europe with a trade agreement called ACTA. So I want to close with this, which is essentially a message of hope and opportunity. Now, when I was a grad student, I read this book Walter Lippmann wrote in 1922, and basically it is the most devastating critique of democracy I've ever read. By a guy who loves democracy, but could not understand how it would work in a complex society. What he said essentially is modern societies are too complicated for us to expect that any citizen can learn all that she needs to know to self-govern, to make good decisions on every issue. And as a result, companies and powerful organizations and centralized authority will control the government because the vast majority of citizens will simply be ignorant. It was a very depressing and unrelenting vision of what the future of democracy would look like. And you can see, in a lot of ways, Lippmann was right. But what Lippmann never anticipated was this. Lippmann never anticipated that we might be able to use networks, small groups of people organizing together to represent one another. As NGOs, what we do is we help people understand the connection between their lived experiences, the problems and the opportunities and their hopes and fears that they have in their lived experiences. We help to connect that to the policy process and give people an opportunity to make change that then comes back and affects their lived experiences again. Political scientists call that monitoring costs. Not everyone can pay attention to all these complex issues and learn all of their ins and outs and be present in front of government at every committee hearing and every vote. We do that as NGOs, as public service organizations. We pay the monitoring costs, and by working together in a network, small groups of organizations can adopt the same logic of network as catalyst, and we can build movements which actually revitalize self-government by spreading information, education, by organizing people on issues they never thought themselves to be a part of, and engaging them in advocacy to make change. That, I think, is the business of politics and NGOs in the internet age. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. We take questions. Do you have questions? Fragen? Hände hoch und wir schicken euch jemanden. Hands up. So much about networks and interaction. Over here, okay. On your phone.
Hi, my name is Tina. I wondered, so this is what's going on right now. What do you think will be the next thing or the next step? How will it evolve, or what kind of tendencies do you see and in which direction you think it's going?
Well, it's always dangerous to predict the future, so I'll make a few simple comments. One is, more people are going to get connected over the coming years. We now have 2 billion internet users globally. That number is likely to double in the next 3 or 4 years, and most of the internet users will no longer be in developed countries. So if you're working on a global policy issue, that should open your eyes about what might happen in the future. Second thing that's going to happen is the cost of the smartphones, which probably 95% of you have in your jackets, is going to drop by 50%. And so more people are going to have powerful computers with them at all times. That's going to change network effects. Third thing that I would say is, while Facebook and Twitter may fade away and be replaced by other social media networks, the desire of people to chat with one another is universal and will continue. And so I think that the logic of information flows enabled by networks will continue. And so as a planner in an NGO, my counsel to you would be think about the effect of networks on your organization and your issue today, and expect that that growth will be at least linear and potentially exponential over the coming years.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk, quite amazing. You talked about the situation, how networks become, essentially help us redistribute the power, distribute the power dynamics from sort of a central structure into a multi-node structure. And I'm sure you're quite familiar with the situation in Iran from that Bolotarian name there. I want to know your opinion on the case when the network essentially pushed outside of the equation. So there is no network. The possibility of having a network is really not there. Thank you.
It's a great question. So it's interesting, 30 years ago, if you wanted to have a political revolution, or you took over the broadcast stations. And if you want to stop a political revolution, you put guys with guns around the broadcast stations. Today, if you want to start a political revolution, you go online. And if you want to stop a political revolution, you control the network. And you turn it into a police state and a surveillance system, and you eliminate all of the most powerful nodes in that network that can become a catalyst. And that's essentially what's happening in Iran. The only thing you can do in that context is go back offline into traditional organizing methods, or you can build your own network. And so the most interesting things that are happening in internet freedom space, in my opinion, are efforts to build communication systems that do not depend upon traditional infrastructure, telephone networks, cable networks, mobile phone systems, so that people can communicate with one another and benefit from the logic of a network as catalyst without endangering themselves. I think we're a couple of years away from ad hoc mesh networking technologies that will allow all of our mobile phones to communicate peer-to-peer, will allow you essentially in a room like this to create a network that is completely independent from any commercial service provider or any government surveillance. But I think that is the natural place that this is going to go. It's communications technologies and network communications, the logic is sort of like a balloon. If you push on the balloon over here, somewhere over here, it goes out. And so I think that's what's happening now, is that governments are trying over and over to close off all the opportunities for networks to empower political and social movements. And people are figuring out new and better ways to get around those problems. But it takes time, and it's dangerous in places like Iran.
Hi. Hello? Hi. I was wondering, you mentioned the importance of the interactions with traditional media for impact and publicity, and I was wondering, do you think we don't only need these for impact and publicity, but also for, framing and interpreting what we hear and what we get from all over the place? Or do you think in the long run, even this middleman will somehow get eliminated?
Oh, I think it's less about PR than it is about framing and interpretation. I mean, journalists are people. People with limited time and overwhelming scope of responsibilities in newsrooms with budget pressure, and they're looking to figure out how to write about a story on an issue that they are probably not an expert on. Now, this gets to a whole set of ideas in social communications theory, which I'll categorize as meme formation. You've probably heard this term if you're not an expert on it. Meme formation essentially is exactly that. Can I create, through the network, a way to interpret this event which becomes normative? That is the gold standard for any communications operation using social networks to do not public relations, here's my message, please reprint it, but to do framing and interpretation, here's my understanding, please internalize it. And that is a big move, but if you can successfully pull it off, it's very powerful.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Anybody wants to? Okay, great.
You sounded overly optimistic. Why should we be, positive about the future of networking and the internet as a catalyst force, as you put it, when you see this rise in mass surveillance, mass interception technology, and governments and corporations basically getting into the market? Do you see a 1984 future, or do you think that people can still master and circumvent surveillance, etc.?
It's a very important question. So here's my basic thought on this. One is, there is a set of countries who will do everything in their power to stop this from happening. They will turn their networks into a police state. But most countries won't do that. And most countries actually, even if they wanted to do that, don't have the resources to dedicate to tracking down every single individual who does anything that the government may not like. So that's point number one. And there's a set of tactics to go with both categories of countries. One we discussed in the question about Iran. It's going to be much more difficult, it's going to be much more dangerous, and it's going to take a lot more time. But I think ultimately the logic of networks and the desire of people are still there to try to build those solutions. But in the vast majority of places, the vast majority of the time, I think there is lots of room for optimism, in part because we get captured by images of the Arab Spring. We get captured by images of the big events in global politics where the internet played a role, and I'm guilty of that too. I use them as examples in my presentation. But of course, the vast majority of uses of the internet are not revolutions. They are not giant political campaigns. They are everyday social and political interactions. They are communications among small groups of people. But it is that kind of communications that gradually changes the society over time. Access to information in large numbers, the ability to communicate with people of like mind but of unknown identity, changes the way you think about your society. And that's what gives me optimism, even though, you know, I have seen some of the worst of what the internet can bring in terms of surveillance and repression, and it's awful and it's scary, but people are going to communicate no matter what. That's the lesson that I learned at the State Department. People would say, you know, you got to stop encouraging people to use the internet because it's too dangerous. And we thought long and hard about that and essentially came up with the conclusion that, look, people are going to use the internet. That is our operating assumption. And from there, our choice is, okay, what are we going to do about it now? We don't have control over the information system anymore. We don't have control over people's behaviors. All we can do is decide how to engage with them once they're online and building their social and political movements on their own. And it's a brave new world for governments to admit that there's no control over the information system anymore, but it is a huge opportunity for small organizations, networks of individuals to think about the network as a catalyst for political and social change.
Kurze Bitte an die Gäste der Recampaign, noch kurz sitzen zu bleiben für ein paar letzte Ansagen, aber erstmal many thanks to Ben and Scott. Thank you.